We've now discussed the kinds of roles available in Kubernetes. Those are ordinary roles and cluster roles. Let's now talk about how those roles can be bound to identities. It is this binding between a role and an identity which will really give us identity and access management. The basic object required for this binding is a role binding object. This object will grant permissions defined in a role or a cluster role to either a user or to a set of users. So there are two important implications here that we should be clear on. A role binding can be used not only with a role but also with a cluster role. That's the first important bit to keep in mind. The second is that the identities being bound could either be users, that is individuals, or groups of individuals, or even service accounts. Let's quickly go ahead and check out an example from the docs for a role binding which will grant the pod reader role to a specific user named Jane within the default namespace. Let's walk through that YAML so that we know we understand it. The object kind is role binding, no surprises there. There is an API version which is rbac.authorization.katest.io version 1. The metadata includes the name of this role binding, which is read pods, the namespace, which is default. The identities are defined in the subjects clause. Here the identity is of kind user. The name of that identity is Jane. In addition to the identity, of course, is a reference to a role. And that role here is of kind simple role, which means that it is not a cluster role. The name of the role being referenced is pod reader, and once again there is an API group in there. If we go ahead and execute this YAML using kubectl apply -f, that will actually have the effect of creating the role binding object. That role binding object is going to actually grant the permissions to read pods to a specific user. That user is Jane. Now, here is something to ponder over. We've just stated that role binding objects can reference either ordinary roles or cluster roles. What would happen? What would be the effect of referencing a cluster role from within a role binding? And it turns out that if we do that, that is, if we reference a cluster role from within a role binding, that cluster role is still only going to apply to the specific namespace which is defined in the role binding. This is important for us to understand. A role binding can reference either a cluster role or an ordinary role, but even if it references a cluster role, that role binding will only apply to the namespace which has been specified in the template, in the specification of the role binding. Here, for instance, our role binding applies to the default namespace. So even if the role ref had a cluster role in there, this role binding would only apply to the default namespace. Let's now talk about cluster role bindings. These are very similar to role bindings, but they will grant permissions at the cluster level and across all namespaces. The specification of a cluster role binding looks very much like that of a role binding. The object kind is now cluster role binding. It has a subjects clause and then it has a role ref. The key difference between a cluster role binding and a role binding specification, you guessed it, the cluster role binding does not include a namespace in its metadata. That's because the cluster role binding by definition has to apply across the entire cluster rather than to any specific namespace.